April 15th, 2024, 18:30 hours, Camp Pendleton, California. The civilian sedan rolled into the parking lot with deliberate precision. Not too fast, not too slow. Just another vehicle among hundreds scattered across the asphalt expanse of Marine Corps Base Camp Pendleton. Colonel Catherine Brennan killed the engine and sat motionless for 17 seconds, studying her reflection in the rearview mirror. Dark jeans, gray Henley shirt, hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, no makeup, no jewelry except for the watch her father had given her when she graduated from Annapolis 20 years ago. The watch had survived 4 combat deployments, countless training exercises, and more close calls than she cared to remember. It kept perfect time, always had. To anyone watching from the mess hall windows, she looked like a young civilian contractor. Maybe someone's girlfriend visiting the base. Perhaps a social worker checking on family services. Certainly not the commanding officer of the 2nd Marine Expeditionary Unit. Certainly not the woman responsible for 3,000 Marines and their combat readiness. Exactly as she intended. Catherine stepped out of the car and locked it with a deliberate click. The evening air carried that peculiar Southern California mixture of ocean salt, diesel fuel, and gun oil, a scent that had become as familiar to her as her own pulse after 16 years of service. She breathed it in, let it settle in her lungs, and felt her mind shift into the operational mode she had cultivated during her years running reconnaissance operations in Fallujah. The weight of the concealed radio pressed against her lower back, hidden beneath the loose fabric of her shirt. Her eyes swept the parking area with practiced efficiency. 12 Marines entering the mess hall in 30 seconds. Good flow, no bottlenecks. The evening meal service was running smoothly. She had been planning this for 6 weeks. 6 weeks of reading morale reports that painted an increasingly concerning picture. 6 weeks of watching statistics that showed declining re-enlistment rates among junior enlisted Marines. 6 weeks of carefully worded complaints from company commanders about attitude problems they couldn't quite identify or quantify. Something was poisoning the culture of her unit, something subtle, something that didn't show up in official channels, but spread through informal networks like a virus through unvaccinated populations. And Catherine Brennan had learned long ago that the best intelligence came not from reports and briefings, but from seeing things with your own eyes, hearing things with your own ears. She pulled the mess hall door open and stepped inside. The enlisted mess hall at Camp Pendleton was a cavernous space capable of feeding 300 Marines at a time. Industrial ceiling fans rotated slowly overhead, stirring air that smelled of fried chicken, steamed vegetables, and that peculiar metallic scent that all military dining facilities seemed to share, regardless of branch or location. The walls were decorated with Marine Corps history, framed photographs of legendary battles, Iwo Jima, Chosin Reservoir, Khe Sanh, Fallujah, each image a reminder of the standards every person in this room was expected to uphold. Catherine moved through the space like water flowing around stones. Years of reconnaissance training had taught her how to move without drawing attention, how to blend into surroundings even when every instinct screamed that she stood out. She grabbed a tray from the stack near the serving line and joined the queue of Marines waiting for their evening meal. The young private first class working the serving line barely glanced at her as he loaded her tray with chicken, rice, and green beans. His name tape read, Morrison. He looked about 19, his uniform crisp, his bearing proper. He represented the future of the Marine Corps, young men and women who had volunteered to serve something larger than themselves. The weight of responsibility for their development pressed down on Catherine's shoulders like a physical force. She moved through the line, accepted a glass of water from another young Marine, and turned to survey the seating area. Her eyes cataloged everything with the precision of an intelligence analyst building a target package. 47 Marines currently present, 8 distinct social groupings based on seating patterns. 3 tables near the windows were the senior lance corporals and junior NCOs congregated. Their body language suggested they considered themselves the informal leadership of the enlisted ranks. 5 tables in the center section occupied by younger Marines, mostly privates, first class, and junior lance corporals. Their animated conversations and frequent laughter indicated less time in service and fewer burdens of responsibility. And there, in the corner section near the beverage station, a table of 5 Marines that immediately captured her attention. Catherine carried her tray toward an empty table positioned approximately 15 feet from the group, close enough to hear their conversation without straining, far enough to avoid obvious eavesdropping. She sat down facing their direction, her peripheral vision locked on their body language, while her direct gaze remained carefully neutral, focused on her meal. The dominant figure at the table was impossible to miss: Lance Corporal Garrett Sullivan. Tall, probably 6'2", with a kind of athletic build that suggested he spent his off-duty hours in the base gym rather than the local bars. His uniform was properly maintained, his bearing confident, his posture relaxed but not sloppy. 24 years old, according to the service record she had memorized. 4 years in service. Expert rifle qualification. Physical fitness test scores consistently first class with multiple perfect 300s. He was speaking, his hands moving in broad gestures, his voice carrying just far enough for Catherine to catch individual words without straining. She ate slowly, methodically, processing both the food and the intelligence-gathering opportunity before her. Sullivan's voice rose slightly, enthusiasm or frustration adding volume to his words. "I'm telling you, man, the system is completely rigged. You can work your ass off, max your PFT, qualify expert on the range, and still get passed over for promotion because some bootlicker knows how to play the game." The Marines around him nodded. Their expressions suggested they had heard this complaint before and found it validating. One of them, a younger Lance Corporal whose name tape read Anderson, leaned forward. "What about Thompson? He made corporal in 3 years." "Yeah, because he's buddy-buddy with the company gunny," Sullivan replied, his tone dismissive. "It's not about competence anymore. It's about who you know and how well you kiss ass." Catherine's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She took a sip of water, her eyes never leaving her tray, her hearing focused entirely on the conversation 15 feet away. This was it, the epicenter of the morale problem that had been showing up in her weekly intelligence briefings. Not a systemic failure of the promotion system, but a failure of understanding. A void of mentorship that allowed rumors and assumptions to metastasize into resentment. Sullivan continued, his voice taking on an edge that made the Marines around him shift uncomfortably. "And now we've got Colonel Brennan running the show. First female MEU commander. You think she earned that through combat effectiveness?" He paused for effect. "Please, this is all politics. All about checking boxes for diversity quotas." The words hit Catherine like incoming rounds. She maintained her neutral expression through sheer force of will, the same discipline that had kept her face calm when a sniper's bullet had passed 3 inches from her head in Helmand Province. The same control that had allowed her to call in close air support while rounds impacted the wall behind her position in Fallujah. Her hand remained steady as she lifted her fork. Her breathing stayed even and controlled. But inside, beneath the carefully constructed exterior, anger burned white-hot. Not because she was offended, she had heard worse, endured more direct challenges to her authority and competence. The anger came from a different source entirely. These Marines, her Marines, were forming opinions based on zero factual information. They were allowing ignorance and assumption to poison their judgment. That was a leadership failure, and ultimately the responsibility for that failure rested on her shoulders. Another Marine at the table, a private first class named Porter, spoke up hesitantly. "I heard she's got a silver star." "That's not politics. That's combat." Sullivan waved his hand dismissively. "Probably for something administrative. You know how it works. Officers get medals for showing up. Enlisted guys get medals for bleeding. Catherine set her fork down carefully. Her mind shifted from anger to clinical analysis. Sullivan was a natural leader. That much was obvious. His peers listened when he spoke. He had the physical presence and confidence that Marines respected. But he was also profoundly ignorant. And that ignorance was being broadcast to every Marine in his circle of influence. Left unchecked, Sullivan would continue spreading his toxic assumptions, creating a culture of cynicism and resentment that would undermine unit cohesion. This was more than a morale problem. This was a cancer that needed to be removed, or in this case, transformed into something healthy. She watched Sullivan stand up from his table, his tray empty, clearly heading back to the serving line for seconds. His path would take him directly past her position. Catherine calculated distances, trajectories, timing. 2.3 seconds until he reached her table. His attention was focused entirely on his companions. His head turned back toward them as he continued talking, gesturing emphatically with his hands. He wasn't watching where he was going. Catherine saw the collision coming before it happened. She could have moved, shifted her chair, warned him. Instead, she remained perfectly still, her body positioned exactly where it was, her water glass sitting at the edge of the table, within easy striking distance of a careless hip. Sullivan's body collided with her table at the exact moment she had predicted. The impact was significant, jarring the entire table forward. Catherine's water glass tipped, spilled, sent a cascade of cold water across her civilian clothes. The liquid soaked through the gray fabric of her Henley, cold against her skin. She remained seated, her expression neutral, her eyes tracking Sullivan's reaction with the focused intensity of a sniper acquiring a target. What happened next would tell her everything she needed to know about Garrett Sullivan's character. His first reaction was not concern, not an apology, not even basic acknowledgement of what had occurred. His first reaction was anger. "Watch where you're sitting," Sullivan snapped, his voice loud enough to cut through the ambient noise of the mess hall. His face showed irritation, his body language aggressive rather than apologetic. He stared down at Catherine as if she had deliberately positioned herself as an obstacle in his path. The conversations at nearby tables died. Marines turned to watch, their expressions ranging from curiosity to concern. The social dynamics of the room shifted instantly, all attention focusing on the interaction between the large, aggressive Marine and the small woman in civilian clothes who was now soaking wet. Catherine looked up at Sullivan slowly, her face calm, her dark eyes meeting his without flinching. Water dripped from her shirt onto the floor. She could feel the cold spreading across her chest and stomach. She let the silence stretch, giving him space and time to recognize his error, to course correct, to demonstrate even basic military courtesy. "Excuse me," she said quietly, her voice carrying just enough volume to be heard at the surrounding tables. Not a challenge, not submission, simply a neutral statement that offered him an opportunity to recalibrate his response. Sullivan doubled down instead. "You're sitting right in the walkway," he continued, his tone dismissive, his posture unchanged. "People are trying to get through here." Catherine processed this with the detached analysis of someone studying enemy behavior patterns. He was deflecting responsibility, blaming the victim, demonstrating precisely the kind of leadership failure that destroyed unit cohesion and undermined military effectiveness. And he was doing it publicly, in front of at least 20 witnesses, with no apparent awareness of how thoroughly he was revealing his own character deficiencies. The Marines at Sullivan's original table were watching now, their expressions shifting from amusement to concern. Unlike Sullivan, they seemed to sense that something was wrong with this interaction, that their friend had stepped into a situation that was rapidly moving beyond his control. Catherine remained seated, her hands resting calmly on the table, her breathing even and controlled. She was running a tactical assessment in real time, evaluating Sullivan's leadership potential against his current behavior, calculating whether he possessed the self-awareness and integrity required for growth. "I think there might be some confusion here," she said, her tone still neutral, still offering him an exit ramp from the mistake he was making. Sullivan interpreted her calm response as weakness rather than professionalism. The mess hall around them had grown noticeably quieter, Marines at other tables sensing tension, beginning to pay attention to the confrontation unfolding near the beverage station. "No confusion at all," Sullivan replied, his voice carrying a dismissive edge that made several Marines wince. "Maybe next time, pick a table that's not in everyone's way." Catherine felt something shift inside her, a cold clarity that came from years of combat experience and command responsibility. This was no longer just about Garrett Sullivan's personal failure. This was a teaching moment, an opportunity to address the toxic culture of assumption and disrespect that had been festering in her unit. Sullivan had made himself the perfect case study, and every Marine watching this interaction was about to receive an education in leadership principles. She stood slowly, deliberately, her movements controlled and precise. Water dripped from her clothes onto the tile floor. She was roughly eye level with Sullivan now, though he still had several inches of height advantage. Her physical presence, however, carried something that height alone could not convey. There was steel in her spine, authority in her bearing, command presence that radiated from her like heat from a forge. "I see," she said simply, her voice quiet but carrying an unmistakable weight that made Marines at surrounding tables shift uncomfortably in their seats. Sullivan's confidence wavered slightly. Something in her tone, in the way she held herself, triggered warning signals in his combat-trained brain. But his ego overrode his instincts. "Yeah, well, maybe be more careful next time," he said, starting to turn away, apparently considering the matter settled in his favor. This dismissal represented the final failure point. Catherine had given Sullivan multiple opportunities to recognize his mistake, to apologize appropriately, to demonstrate basic military courtesy. He had rejected every opportunity, choosing instead to compound his initial error with escalating disrespect. The moment had arrived. "Lance Corporal Sullivan," Catherine said quietly, using his name and rank for the first time. The effect was immediate and electric. Sullivan spun around, his eyes widening as his brain processed multiple pieces of information simultaneously. This civilian woman knew his name. She knew his rank, and her manner of address carried unmistakable military authority. The mess hall fell completely silent. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Forks paused halfway to mouths. Every Marine within earshot recognized that something significant was happening, even if they did not yet understand the full scope of what they were witnessing. Sullivan's face began to change, confidence draining away, replaced by growing uncertainty and the first stirrings of genuine fear. His military training was finally overriding his civilian assumptions. His posture shifted, shoulders pulling back slightly, hands moving toward his sides, body unconsciously adopting a more respectful bearing. Catherine watched the transformation with clinical interest. This was the moment when most people began to understand the magnitude of their mistake. This was when character revealed itself, when a person either doubled down on their errors or demonstrated the capacity for growth. "I think we need to have a conversation," Catherine continued, her voice still quiet, but carrying the weight of command that came from years of leading Marines in combat. "Would you agree?" The question was rhetorical, and Sullivan seemed to finally understand that he was no longer in control of this interaction. His earlier aggression had evaporated completely, replaced by the kind of deer-in-headlights expression that suggested his brain was working overtime to process how badly he had misjudged the situation. Movement at the edge of Catherine's vision drew her attention. Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Dalton, the mess hall supervisor, was approaching from across the room. His expression showed professional concern mixed with curiosity as he assessed the unusual dynamic developing in his dining facility. Dalton was 45 years old, 22 years of service, a combat veteran who had seen enough military drama to recognize when something important was happening. Catherine caught his eye and gave him a subtle hand gesture, barely more than a slight movement of her fingers. It was a signal from intelligence operations, classified training that she had learned years ago, a way of communicating to fellow professionals that an operation was in progress and should not be interrupted. Dalton caught the signal instantly. His eyes widened almost imperceptibly, and his approach shifted from intervention mode to observation mode. He continued moving toward them, but his body language had changed from supervisor handling a problem to professional witnessing an important event. Sullivan's head swiveled between Catherine and the approaching gunnery sergeant, confusion evident on his face. He was clearly struggling to understand why his supervisor was treating this situation with such unusual gravity. "Everything all right over here?" Dalton called out as he approached, his voice carrying the authoritative tone that Marines recognized as serious business rather than casual inquiry. Catherine turned toward him with a slight smile that did not reach her eyes. "Good evening, Gunnery Sergeant Dalton. I believe Lance Corporal Sullivan and I are just working through a small misunderstanding." Dalton stopped short. The fact that this civilian woman knew his name and rank caused visible surprise to register on his weathered face. His eyes swept over Catherine again, this time looking past the civilian clothes and casual appearance, searching for clues about her true identity and position. "Ma'am," Dalton said carefully, his tone becoming noticeably more respectful as his brain processed implications. The single word carried volumes of meaning to the trained military ear. It signaled recognition of authority, acknowledgement of superior rank, professional deference. Sullivan looked back and forth between them, his confusion deepening. The dynamic between Dalton and this mysterious civilian woman suggested levels of authority that made no sense given her appearance. Gunnery sergeants did not address civilian contractors with that level of formal respect. "Actually, Gunnery Sergeant," Catherine said conversationally, maintaining her cover while setting up the teaching moment she had planned, "I was hoping you might help me with something. I'm conducting an informal assessment of unit morale and discipline standards. Lance Corporal Sullivan here has provided some very interesting insights." Dalton's expression shifted to heightened professional alertness. The phrase informal assessment, combined with obvious authority, suggested this was an official inquiry disguised as casual observation. His 22 years of military experience told him that such assessments usually originated from very senior leadership conducting personal reconnaissance of unit conditions. "Of course, ma'am," Dalton replied, his posture straightening noticeably. "How can we assist?" Sullivan's face had gone pale. The conversation was clearly operating on levels beyond his understanding, but the respectful tones both Dalton and this woman were using suggested layers of authority and importance that he had completely failed to recognize. His earlier aggression had been replaced entirely by nervous uncertainty. Catherine let the silence stretch for several heartbeats, allowing Sullivan to marinate in his growing awareness that he had made a serious error in judgment. Every second of uncomfortable silence was a teaching tool, pressure building, forcing self-reflection. "Well," Catherine continued, her tone remaining casual while delivering surgical observations, "I was interested to observe how Marines handle unexpected situations. For example, when someone accidentally collides with a fellow service member, or perhaps a civilian guest on base, what would you say is the appropriate response, Gunnery Sergeant?" The question was directed at Dalton, but everyone present understood it was really about Sullivan's behavior. Dalton caught the subtext immediately and turned his attention to the Lance Corporal with an expression that promised severe consequences if the wrong answer was provided. Sullivan swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly. "Ma'am, when I bumped into you, I should have," he stammered, struggling to find words that might salvage the situation, finally arriving at the conclusion his training should have provided from the beginning. "I should have immediately stopped, checked if you were injured, apologized sincerely, and offered any assistance needed. Excellent answer, Catherine replied, genuine approval in her voice. She was a teacher at heart, and she believed in reinforcing correct responses even when they came late. That's exactly the standard we expect from Marines. And what would you say is the appropriate response when someone points out that your initial reaction was inappropriate? This question struck closer to home, forcing Sullivan to confront not just his first mistake, but his continued escalation of poor judgment. He glanced toward Dalton, whose expression offered no assistance or mercy. The gunnery sergeant was clearly waiting to see how his Marine would handle this increasingly challenging situation. The appropriate response would be to acknowledge the error immediately, apologize sincerely, and correct the behavior, Sullivan answered, his voice growing stronger as he recognized the path toward redemption that was being offered to him. Not to make excuses or shift blame. Outstanding, Catherine said, and this time her smile carried genuine warmth. That's military leadership principles in action. Now, Lance Corporal Sullivan, would you like to apply those principles to our interaction this evening? Sullivan straightened his posture, drawing on his military training to help him navigate through what was clearly going to be an uncomfortable but necessary correction. Ma'am, I apologize for my completely inappropriate behavior. I collided with you due to my own inattention and lack of situational awareness. Instead of taking immediate responsibility and checking on your welfare, I blamed you for the incident. My behavior was unprofessional, disrespectful, and unbecoming of a United States Marine. The formal apology echoed across the now silent mess hall. Every Marine present was watching, recognizing they were witnessing something important, a teaching moment that transcended the individual interaction and spoke to fundamental principles of military conduct and character. Catherine nodded slowly, acknowledging the apology while preparing to expand the lesson into something even more valuable. Thank you for that acknowledgement, Lance Corporal. That kind of honest self-assessment is the foundation of leadership development. She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the surrounding tables, making eye contact with various Marines who quickly looked away, suddenly very interested in their meals. Now, I'm curious about something else I observed before our collision. During your conversation with your fellow Marines earlier, you expressed some concerns about leadership, about the fairness of the promotion system, and about certain command decisions. Would you be willing to discuss those concerns in a more constructive format? Sullivan's eyes widened as the full implications crashed over him like a rogue wave. This woman, whoever she was, had been observing his table's conversation for at least 30 minutes before their collision. She had heard his complaints, his assumptions, his disrespectful characterizations of superior officers. The situation had just escalated from bad to potentially career-ending. Ma'am, Sullivan began, clearly unsure how to proceed, how much to admit, how deep the hole he had dug actually went. It's all right, Catherine assured him, her tone supportive rather than condemning. Honest feedback about leadership challenges is valuable to any organization, but such feedback needs to be based on facts rather than assumptions, and it needs to be presented through proper channels rather than mess hall gossip. The question is whether you understand the difference between constructive criticism and toxic complaining. Dalton nodded agreement, recognizing the teaching moment Catherine was creating. This was not punishment for punishment's sake. This was leadership development happening in real time, with an audience that would carry these lessons back to their own units and peer groups. The gunnery sergeant cleared his throat diplomatically. Lance Corporal Sullivan, is there something specific you'd like to discuss through the proper chain of command regarding promotion opportunities or duty assignments? Sullivan looked between Catherine and Dalton, clearly struggling with how much to reveal about his earlier complaints, weighing honesty against self-preservation. After several long seconds, he made his choice. Ma'am, gunnery sergeant, I realize now that most of my concerns were based on rumors and assumptions, rather than factual understanding of how the system actually works. I was complaining about things I didn't really understand. It was an honest admission, and Catherine felt a surge of professional satisfaction. Sullivan was capable of growth. He possessed the self-awareness necessary for leadership development. The question now was whether she could convert this crisis moment into lasting behavioral change. "That's a remarkably honest assessment, Lance Corporal," Catherine replied, "and it highlights a common problem in military organizations. When Marines don't understand the systems that govern their careers, rumors and assumptions fill that knowledge void. Those assumptions often create perceptions of unfairness that have no basis in reality." She was building now, constructing the framework for what would come next. The real teaching, the real transformation. But before she could continue, her radio crackled to life. The sound cut through the mess hall like a klaxon. Every Marine in the room recognized the distinctive squelch of military communications equipment. They also recognized that civilian contractors did not carry encrypted tactical radios. "All senior officers report to headquarters immediately," Colonel Brennan acknowledged. Catherine reached behind her back and pulled the radio from beneath her shirt. The movement was smooth, practiced, revealing the equipment she had kept concealed throughout the entire interaction. She keyed the microphone. "Brennan acknowledges. En route in 5 mics." The effect was instantaneous and nuclear. 47 Marines throughout the mess hall snapped to attention with parade ground precision. The sound of chairs scraping against tile floor and boots coming together echoed like thunder. Sullivan's face drained of all color. His mouth opened, closed, opened again, but no sound emerged. Around the room, Marines stood frozen, their eyes wide, their minds clearly racing to process the implications. Colonel Catherine Brennan stood before them now, water-stained civilian clothes and all, and for the first time that evening, her command presence radiated openly, no longer concealed behind the fiction of being an anonymous civilian observer. She looked at Sullivan, whose expression suggested he was experiencing the kind of existential terror that comes from realizing you have criticized your commanding officer to her face for 30 minutes straight. "Lance Corporal Sullivan," Catherine said formally, her voice carrying across the now silent mess hall. "Tomorrow morning, 0800 hours, my office. We have more to discuss." She looked around at the other Marines, her expression serious but not hostile. "The rest of you who were at that table, the invitation stands. Come to my office at 0900 and we'll continue this conversation about leadership, career development, and what it means to be a professional Marine." The spell broke slightly. Marines remained at attention, but their faces showed a mixture of fear, confusion, and dawning comprehension. Catherine walked toward the exit, her wet clothes forgotten, her mind already shifting to whatever crisis required her immediate presence at headquarters. Behind her, she heard Sullivan's voice, barely above a whisper, filled with a mixture of horror and awe. "We just spent an hour complaining about the colonel." To the colonel. Catherine allowed herself the smallest smile as she pushed through the mess hall doors into the cool evening air. The education of Lance Corporal Garrett Sullivan was officially underway. April 16th, 2024, 07:45 hours. Camp Pendleton, California. Lance Corporal Garrett Sullivan had not slept. He stood outside the headquarters building in the pre-dawn darkness, his uniform pressed to razor-sharp perfection, every crease aligned, every brass piece polished to mirror finish, boots reflecting the overhead lights like black glass. He had arrived 15 minutes early, unable to bear the thought of being even 30 seconds late. The night had been endless. Lying in his rack, staring at the ceiling of the barracks, replaying every word he had said in that mess hall, every assumption, every criticism, every moment of disrespect delivered with absolute confidence to the woman who commanded his entire unit. The woman whose silver star he had dismissed as administrative paperwork, The woman whose qualifications he had reduced to diversity quotas. The woman who had stood there in soaking wet civilian clothes and given him multiple chances to demonstrate basic human decency. Chances he had rejected with escalating aggression. Sullivan checked his watch. 0747. 13 minutes until his appointment. He ran through mental checklists, trying to prepare for a conversation he had no framework to understand. Was this formal discipline? Would she end his career? Could she end his career? Yes, of course she could. The door opened. A staff sergeant emerged, noticed Sullivan standing at parade rest, and gave him a knowing look that suggested the entire base had already heard about the mess hall incident. She's ready for you, Lance Corporal. 3rd floor. Office at the end of the hall. You'll know it when you see it. Sullivan climbed 3 flights of stairs, his heart rate climbing with each step. The hallway was lined with photographs. Marine Corps history captured in black and white and color. Battles, ceremonies, promotions. The visual documentation of excellence and sacrifice. The door at the end of the hall was partially open. Sullivan could see inside. A spacious office. Large windows overlooking the base, and on the walls a career documented in photographs and citations. He knocked 3 times, sharp and precise. Enter. Sullivan stepped through the doorway and came to attention 3 feet in front of the desk, exactly as regulations specified. Lance Corporal Sullivan, reporting as ordered, ma'am. Colonel Catherine Brennan sat behind her desk, no longer in civilian clothes. She wore her service uniform now, complete with rank insignia and ribbons that told a story Sullivan had been too arrogant to read before last night. She looked younger than he had imagined a colonel would look. 40, maybe. Short dark hair, athletic build, eyes that carried the particular quality of someone who had seen combat and processed it with professional detachment. She studied him for a long moment before speaking. At ease, Lance Corporal. Have a seat. Sullivan moved to the chair facing her desk and sat with careful precision, his back straight, hands resting on his thighs. He looked like a man facing a firing squad with dignity. Catherine leaned back slightly, her posture deliberately relaxed to contrast with his tension. Before we discuss last night, I want to establish something important. This conversation is not a formal disciplinary proceeding. Nothing you say here will be used against you in any official capacity. This is professional development, not punishment. Do you understand the distinction? Yes, ma'am, Sullivan replied, though his expression suggested he did not entirely believe her. Catherine nodded and let silence fill the room for several seconds. It was a technique she had learned from Brigadier General Robert Thorne 14 years ago. Let people sit with their discomfort. Let them process. Don't rush to fill every pause with words. She stood and moved to the window, looking out at Camp Pendleton spread below. Marines conducting morning physical training on the fields. Young men and women running, sweating, pushing themselves toward excellence. Lance Corporal Sullivan, she said, still facing the window, I have a question for you, and I want you to think carefully before answering. She turned to face him. Last night, when you thought I was just a civilian contractor or a visitor, how did you treat me? Sullivan's jaw tightened. And now, knowing I'm your commanding officer, how are you treating me? She moved closer, her voice quiet but carrying absolute clarity. What does that difference say about your character? The question hit Sullivan like incoming artillery. His face flushed, his jaw worked silently, his hands clenched into fists on his thighs before he forced them to relax. For several long seconds he said nothing, clearly struggling with the brutal self-assessment the question demanded. The silence stretched. Catherine waited. This was the moment, the pivot point where people either deflected and made excuses or faced themselves with honesty. Sullivan's voice, when it finally came, was rough with emotion. Ma'am, it tells me that my respect for others is conditional, based on what I think I can get away with. It tells me that I don't have consistent standards of behavior. It tells me that my character is situation-dependent rather than internally driven. Catherine felt something loosen in her chest, a tension she had been carrying since last night, wondering if Sullivan possessed the self-awareness necessary for growth. He did. "That's an honest and accurate assessment," she said, returning to her desk. "And that honesty is more valuable than you might realize." Many people spend their entire lives avoiding that level of self-examination. The fact that you can articulate your failures means you have the capacity to correct them. She opened a drawer and pulled out a thick folder, setting it on the desk between them. Sullivan's eyes tracked to the folder with obvious apprehension. "Do you know what this is, Lance Corporal?" "No, ma'am." "This is your service record book, your fitness reports, your training records, your performance evaluations, every official document related to your Marine Corps career." Catherine opened the folder and began reading aloud, her voice carrying neither praise nor condemnation, just factual recitation. "Rifle qualification, expert, 297 out of 300. Physical fitness test scores, consistently first class. Multiple perfect 300 scores. Leadership billets, team leader, guide and recruit training, primary instructor for vehicle operations." She looked up at Sullivan. "Recommendations from your platoon sergeant describing you as," and I quote, "a natural leader with strong tactical instincts and the ability to motivate peers through example rather than authority." She paused, letting that sink in. "Based on this record, Lance Corporal, you should be wearing corporal chevrons already. Your technical competence is exceptional. Your physical performance is outstanding. Your peers respect you. Your immediate supervisors recognize your potential." Sullivan's expression shifted from apprehension to confusion. "So why are you still a Lance Corporal?" She flipped to another section of the folder. "Because every time you come up for promotion consideration, there are negative counseling entries in your record, attitude problems, disrespectful comments about superior officers, failure to support command decisions." Catherine pulled out a specific document and slid it across the desk. "3 weeks ago, your company commander documented that you were overheard in the smoke pit making disparaging comments about my leadership qualifications based on my gender. Do you remember that conversation?" Sullivan's face went from pale to crimson. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Catherine held up a hand. "I don't want an apology right now. I want you to understand cause and effect. You complained last night that the promotion system is rigged, that Marines who play politics get advanced, while competent Marines get passed over. But the truth is that you have been passed over because of your own choices, your own behavior, your own failure to maintain professional standards." She closed the folder and pushed it toward him. "Your technical skills are ready for increased responsibility. Your character development is not." The words hung in the air between them, brutal in their honesty, impossible to refute with the evidence sitting on the desk. Sullivan's voice was barely above a whisper when he finally spoke. "Ma'am, I've been blaming the system for problems I created myself." "Yes," Catherine confirmed simply, "and you're not alone in that. Many Marines make the same mistake. They confuse their perception of unfairness with actual unfairness. They assume that because they don't understand how decisions are made, those decisions must be arbitrary or political." She stood and moved to a bookshelf, pulling down a framed photograph. She handed it to Sullivan. The image showed a much younger Catherine, barely 26 years old, standing at attention in dress blues, while a stern-faced officer with stars on his collar pinned lieutenant bars on her uniform. "That's Brigadier General Robert Thorne, retired now, 67 years old, the man who shaped my understanding of what leadership truly means." Sullivan studied the photograph, confused about its relevance. Catherine took it back and returned it to the shelf. 14 years ago, I was a young lieutenant, fresh from the basic school, full of tactical knowledge and empty of wisdom. I walked into the base gym at Quantico one evening and encountered an older man in civilian workout clothes struggling with a bench press. The weight looked too heavy for him. His form was poor. She smiled slightly at the memory, though the smile carried embarrassment. And young Lieutenant Catherine Brennan, arrogant and ignorant in equal measure, offered unsolicited advice, delivered with a kind of condescension that makes me cringe now to remember it. I lectured this man about proper technique and safety protocols, told him he was going to hurt himself if he didn't listen to people who knew better. Sullivan's eyes widened slightly, beginning to understand where this story was going. The man thanked me politely for my concern, and then the next morning, Lieutenant Brennan walked into a formation where that same man, now wearing the stars of a brigadier general, was conducting an inspection of my officer training battalion. "Oh, God," Sullivan breathed. General Thorne did not confront me publicly. He did not humiliate me in front of my peers. Instead, he requested a private meeting in his office, where he spent 2 hours teaching me about assumptions, about respect, about the difference between knowledge and wisdom. He used the exact same method I'm using with you right now, the Socratic approach, asking questions that force self-examination rather than simply delivering punishment. Catherine returned to her chair. He could have ended my career before it truly began. One word from him and I would have been finished. Instead, he invested in my growth, used my mistake as a teaching moment, guided me toward understanding rather than simply punishing my ignorance. She leaned forward, her eyes locked on Sullivan's. That conversation taught me more about leadership than any classroom or field exercise ever could. And now, standing in my own office with command responsibility for 3,000 Marines, I understand that I owe you the same investment that Thorne made in me. Not because you deserve it based on your behavior, but because the Marine Corps deserves leaders who will break the cycle of toxic leadership and replace it with genuine mentorship. Sullivan sat perfectly still, processing this information. His expression showed something shifting inside him, some fundamental recalibration of how he understood the world. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "you're paying forward what he did for you." Exactly. And someday, Lance Corporal, when you're a senior NCO, or perhaps an officer yourself, you'll face a similar situation. You'll encounter a young Marine who makes the same kinds of mistakes you made, and you'll have to decide whether to punish them or invest in their growth. That's when you'll truly understand what leadership means. Catherine opened her desk drawer and pulled out a notepad and pen. "But here's what you need to understand. General Thorne invested in me because I demonstrated the capacity for growth. I listened. I learned. I changed my behavior. If I had rejected his teaching, if I had remained defensive and made excuses, he would have taken formal disciplinary action. The opportunity for mentorship is a gift, but it requires the recipient to be willing to receive it." Sullivan straightened in his chair. "Ma'am, I'm willing. Last night was a wake-up call. I don't want to waste the opportunity you're giving me." "Good. Then let's talk about what happens next." Catherine began writing on the notepad. "First requirement, you're going to schedule appointments with your career planner, your company commander, and your platoon sergeant. Within 1 week, you're going to have honest conversations with each of them about your career goals and what you need to do to achieve them. But here's the key. You're going to come to each meeting prepared. Research the promotion system first. Study the regulations. Prepare specific questions. Don't just show up expecting to be spoon-fed information." Sullivan pulled out his own notepad and began taking notes. Second requirement, you're going to complete the Marine Corps Leadership Distance Education courses, all of them, within 45 days, and you're going to score 95% or higher on every exam. Not because I'm ordering you to, but because you need that knowledge to be the leader you want to become. Sullivan's pen flew across the page. Third requirement, and this is the most important one, you're going to organize an informal professional development session for your peers. The Marines who were sitting at your table last night, the Marines who have been listening to your complaints and forming their opinions based on your assumptions. You're going to share what you've learned about the promotion system, about leadership, about the cost of toxic cynicism. You're going to correct the misinformation you spread and replace it with factual knowledge. Sullivan's pen paused. Ma'am, what if they don't listen to me? What if I've lost their respect? That's a risk you'll have to take. Leadership requires courage, including the courage to admit when you were wrong and the courage to try to make things right, even when success isn't guaranteed. But here's what I know about Marines. They respect authenticity and growth more than they respect perfection. If you approach them honestly, if you demonstrate genuine change, they'll listen. She set down her pen. Those are the requirements. Complete them within 45 days, starting today, April 16th through May 31st. Do you accept? Sullivan met her eyes directly for the first time since entering the office. Yes, ma'am, I accept. All of it. Outstanding. Then you're dismissed. Get breakfast, clear your head, and start working on requirement number 1. I want to see documentation of those appointments by close of business Friday. Sullivan stood and came to attention. Ma'am, before I go, may I say something? Go ahead. Thank you for last night, for this morning, for everything. I won't let you down. Catherine's expression softened slightly. Don't thank me yet, Lance Corporal. We're just getting started. Now get out of my office before I change my mind about being nice. The ghost of a smile flickered across Sullivan's face before he executed an about-face and marched toward the door. Lance Corporal, Catherine called out just as he reached the threshold. He stopped and turned. The fact that you can admit your mistakes and commit to changing tells me everything I need to know about whether this investment will pay off. Don't prove me wrong. I won't, ma'am, I promise. After Sullivan left, Catherine returned to the window and watched him cross the parade ground below. His stride had changed. Still military bearing, but something different in his posture now. Purpose, maybe, or the weight of genuine commitment. Her phone buzzed. A text message from Gunnery Sergeant Dalton. Ma'am, the mess hall is buzzing this morning. Every Marine who was there last night has told the story to everyone they know. Sullivan's going to have an audience for whatever comes next. Catherine typed a reply. Good. Leadership development works better with witnesses. Keep me informed of his progress. The next 45 days would tell her everything she needed to know. April 16th through May 31st, 2024. The transformation happened in stages, each week building on the last. Within 36 hours, Sullivan had scheduled all 3 appointments. His career planner meeting on April 18th lasted 90 minutes. The planner later told Captain Rachel Winters it was the most productive counseling session he'd conducted in 3 years. Sullivan arrived with 14 prepared questions about promotion requirements, composite scores, career progression timelines. Not the usual vague complaints about unfairness, but specific inquiries demonstrating genuine intellectual engagement. By late April, Sullivan was spending evenings in the base library. His roommates noticed the change immediately. Where before he'd spent off-duty hours in the gym or the smoke pit spreading cynicism, now he was building knowledge to replace assumptions. Leadership theory, promotion regulations, professional military education requirements. When Lance Corporal Blake Anderson confronted him in the smoke pit on April 21st, 15 Marines witnessed the exchange. So what, you're kissing ass now? You get caught bad-mouthing the colonel and suddenly you're the model Marine? Sullivan's response demonstrated the beginning of his transformation. Blake, I'm changing because I got caught, yeah. Getting caught forced me to see the truth. But I'm continuing because I actually believe it now. Everything I thought I knew about promotions was wrong. Everything I told you guys was wrong. And I'm going to fix that. The real test came on April 28th. Private First Class Ethan Porter, the 19-year-old Marine who had been at Sullivan's table in the mess hall, was preparing for his corporal screening board. He had been considering not submitting his package, influenced by Sullivan's previous assertions that the system was rigged against competent Marines who didn't play politics. Sullivan found Porter in the barracks and offered help. 3 hours of volunteer mentoring followed, drilling on leadership principles, helping organize his service record book, arranging a mock screening board with corporals from other platoons who owed Sullivan favors from their gym sessions together. Porter submitted his package on April 30th, passed the screening on his first attempt. Word spread through the battalion like wildfire. The same Sullivan who had been spreading toxic cynicism for months was now investing his personal time developing junior Marines. Something fundamental had shifted. By early May, Gunnery Sergeant Dalton was documenting sustained behavioral change in his weekly reports to Colonel Brennan. "Ma'am, last week I observed Sullivan in the smoke pit when a group of lance corporals were complaining about their platoon sergeant being too strict about uniform standards. The old Sullivan would have joined in, maybe escalated the complaints, validated their grievances. Instead, he shut it down. Explained why standards matter, how discipline in small things builds discipline in large things. Told them if they had legitimate concerns about leadership, they should bring them through proper channels rather than undermining their NCO behind his back." Dalton continued in his report. "The Marines listened, not because Sullivan has rank, but because they respect him. He has natural influence. The question was always whether he would use that influence to build up or tear down. For the first time in his career, I'm seeing him choose to build." But not everyone was convinced. Senior Lance Corporal Brad Wilson, a Marine in the same company who had been passed over for promotion twice, began spreading rumors. Sullivan was playing politics, kissing ass, trying to make everyone else look bad to make himself look good by suddenly acting like the model Marine. The rumor reached Sullivan on May 5th through 3 different sources. Multiple Marines witnessed his response, which showed how much he had internalized the lessons from Colonel Brennan. "Brad can think what he wants. I'm not doing this for recognition. I'm doing it because I was wrong, and I'm trying to make it right. If he wants to learn the truth about promotions, I'm happy to share what I've learned. But I'm not going to defend myself against accusations. My behavior over the next year will speak for itself." Through mid-May, Sullivan's influence on his peer group became measurable through official channels. Porter passed his corporal screening. 2 more Marines from Sullivan's unit scheduled appointments with their career planners, specifically citing conversations with Sullivan as motivation for taking control of their professional development. Captain Winters mentioned in her weekly report to Colonel Brennan that morale in Bravo Company had noticeably improved. The toxic complaining that had characterized smoke pit conversations for months had been replaced by more constructive discussions about career goals and professional education opportunities. By May 20th, 11 days ahead of the deadline Colonel Brennan had set, Sullivan had completed all Marine Corps leadership distance education courses. His final average across all courses was 97.3%. He submitted completion certificates to Colonel Brennan's office with a brief note. "Ma'am, requirements 1 and 2 complete. Working on requirement 3. But the real milestone came on May 19th, when Sullivan reserved briefing room 4 for Saturday morning, June 1st. He sent personal invitations to the 4 Marines who had been at his table that night in April: Porter, Anderson, Morrison, and Private First Class Trevor Daniels, who had listened to Sullivan's complaints about the rig system for months. Then he extended an open invitation through the company. Professional development session. The Marine Corps promotion system. How it actually works versus how rumors say it works. Voluntary attendance. Saturday morning, 0900 hours. 42 Marines volunteered to attend, sacrificing their Saturday morning sleep and liberty to hear what Sullivan had to say. The final week before the presentation, Sullivan prepared with obsessive attention to detail. He built slides explaining cutting scores, composite scores, promotion timelines, organized his thoughts into a coherent narrative, practiced his delivery in front of a mirror in the barracks head. He showed his draft presentation to his platoon sergeant, who made suggestions about clarifying technical terminology, incorporated the feedback, showed the revised version to his company commander, who approved the content and noted in her log that Sullivan had demonstrated remarkable growth in a short period. On May 30th, one day before the presentation, Sullivan did something that surprised even Colonel Brennan. He requested a brief meeting with her. 15 minutes. Something he needed to ask permission for regarding the presentation. Catherine agreed, curious what he wanted. Sullivan arrived at her office at exactly 1400 hours, in perfect uniform, carrying his service record book. "Ma'am, tomorrow is the presentation. I wanted to ask permission to do something that might be unusual." "What did you have in mind, Lance Corporal?" "I want to show them my actual service record, the negative counseling entries, the documentation of how I sabotaged my own career. Not to embarrass myself, but to make it real. To show them that this isn't theoretical, that I'm living proof of how toxic attitude destroys opportunity." Catherine studied him carefully. This was a vulnerable thing to do, exposing his failures to his peers, but it was also exactly the kind of authentic leadership she had hoped to develop. "That's a vulnerable thing to do, Lance Corporal. Are you prepared for how your peers might react?" "Ma'am, if I'm asking them to examine their own assumptions, I need to be willing to expose my own failures. Otherwise, I'm just another hypocrite telling people what to do without showing them how I learned the lessons myself." Catherine felt pride swell in her chest. This was the transformation she had hoped for. Not just compliance with requirements, but genuine internalization of leadership principles. "Permission granted, Lance Corporal. I think it's exactly the right approach." June 1st, 2024, 0900 hours. Colonel Catherine Brennan stood at the back of Briefing Room 4 with Gunnery Sergeant Dalton. They had arrived early, before any of the attending Marines, to observe without influencing the dynamic. 42 Marines filled the seats, 8 women and 34 men, ages ranging from 19 to 35. Some Sullivan knew personally from his unit. Others had come based on word spreading through the base about a Lance Corporal who had gone from toxic complainer to model Marine in 6 weeks. Sullivan stood at the front of the room, his uniform perfect, his bearing professional, but his hands betrayed his nervousness with a slight tremor as he arranged papers on the podium. At exactly 900, he looked out at the assembled Marines and took a deep breath. "Good morning, Marines. Thank you for sacrificing your Saturday morning to be here. I know you could be sleeping in, hitting the beach, or doing literally anything more fun than listening to me talk about promotion systems. The fact that you chose to be here tells me you're serious about your professional development, and I'm going to honor that commitment by not wasting your time." Several Marines nodded. The room was attentive, curious. Sullivan's voice shifted, taking on a more personal tone. "6 weeks ago, I was sitting in the mess hall complaining about how the promotion system was rigged, how leadership didn't care about competent Marines, how politics mattered more than performance. Some of you were sitting with me. Some of you heard those complaints and believed them because I said them with confidence." He paused, letting the silence build. "And I was completely, fundamentally, embarrassingly wrong." The room went silent, every Marine leaning forward now. "I was wrong because I had formed strong opinions about subjects I knew nothing about. I had confused my ignorance with insight, my assumptions with facts. And worse than just being wrong myself, I was spreading that ignorance to every Marine who listened to me. I was poisoning your professional development with my toxic cynicism." Sullivan pulled up his first slide. His own service record, negative counseling entries clearly visible and highlighted in red. "This is my actual service record. Colonel Brennan gave me permission to show you this. Not to embarrass myself, but to make something clear. These negative counseling entries are why I'm still a Lance Corporal, despite having expert rifle qualification, perfect PFT scores, and leadership billets. I blame the system for my lack of advancement, but the real problem was my own behavior." He pointed to specific entries, reading them aloud. 3 weeks before the mess hall incident, disrespectful comments about the colonel's qualifications. 6 months before that. Undermining unit morale through toxic complaining. 9 months before that. Failure to support command decisions. Every time I came up for promotion consideration, this is what the board saw. Not my technical skills, my character deficiencies. Private Porter stood up, clearly unable to contain the question burning inside him. Garrett, how did you figure out that you were the problem? What changed? Sullivan smiled slightly, appreciating the directness of the question. I got caught. I disrespected someone I thought was just a civilian, someone I thought didn't matter, someone I could treat poorly without consequences. Turned out that person was Colonel Brennan, conducting an informal assessment of unit morale. She could have destroyed my career that night with one phone call. Instead, she spent the next 6 weeks teaching me what leadership actually means. He clicked to the next slide, which showed the 3 requirements Colonel Brennan had set. So this morning, I'm going to share what I've learned over the past 45 days. Not because I'm an expert now, but because I went from complete ignorance to basic competence. And that journey taught me things that I think will help you avoid making the same mistakes I made. For the next 50 minutes, Lance Corporal Garrett Sullivan delivered a presentation that would be remembered and discussed for months afterward throughout the 2nd MEU. He broke down the promotion system with clarity and precision, explained cutting scores and how they were calculated from composite scores, addressed misconceptions with factual corrections backed by actual regulations he had studied, provided concrete examples of how Marines could improve their promotion competitiveness through actions within their control. But what impressed Catherine most, standing at the back of the room observing, was not his command of technical material. That was good, certainly, but teachable. What impressed her was his ability to connect that material to emotional truth, to make abstract policies relevant to the lived experiences of the Marines in front of him. Here's what I wish someone had told me 2 years ago, Sullivan said, pulling up a slide showing his promotion timeline with brutal honesty about missed opportunities. I blamed the system for my failures, but the system was accurately identifying problems I refused to see. My technical skills were ready for increased responsibility. My character wasn't. The system wasn't broken. I was. The presentation built naturally toward its conclusion. Porter stood again, his voice carrying emotion that made several other Marines nod in recognition. You prepared me for my corporal screening when you didn't have to. You spent 3 hours helping me when you could have been doing anything else. That's real leadership, brother. Thank you. The room erupted in applause. Sullivan's face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and pride. This was validation not from authority figures, but from peers who had witnessed his transformation firsthand. When the applause died down, Sullivan gestured toward the back of the room where Catherine stood. Marines, before we wrap up, I want to acknowledge someone who made this presentation possible. Colonel Brennan is standing in the back. She could have ended my career 6 weeks ago when I disrespected her in the mess hall. Instead, she invested in my growth. She taught me that leadership isn't about demanding compliance through authority. It's about earning respect through competence and character. Ma'am, would you like to say anything to close us out? Every head turned toward Catherine. She had not planned to speak, had intended to remain a silent observer, but Sullivan's invitation was sincere, and the moment called for leadership presence rather than invisible oversight. She moved from the back of the room toward the front, her steps measured and deliberate, positioned herself beside Sullivan, facing the 42 Marines who had chosen to be here. Marines, Catherine began, her voice carrying command authority but also genuine warmth. What you witnessed this morning is what transformation looks like. Lance Corporal Sullivan stood in front of you and admitted his mistakes with complete honesty. He showed you his actual service record, his actual failures, his actual growth. That takes more courage than any combat action I've observed. She paused, making eye contact with various Marines throughout the room. 6 weeks ago, Lance Corporal Sullivan made a serious error in judgment. He disrespected what he thought was a civilian woman in the mess hall. He refused to take responsibility for his mistake. He blamed others for problems he created. And in the weeks before that incident, he had been spreading toxic cynicism that undermined the professional development of every Marine who listened to him. Sullivan stood beside her at attention, his expression serious as Catherine recounted his failures publicly. No shame in his bearing now, just acceptance of truth and commitment to different behavior moving forward. But here's what I saw that night that many of you might have missed. I saw a Marine who was capable of growth. I saw someone who responded to questioning, who engaged intellectually with challenging ideas, who demonstrated capacity for self-reflection. I saw raw leadership potential buried under layers of ignorance and misplaced anger. She turned slightly to face Sullivan directly. "Lance Corporal, you've completed every requirement I set for you. Distance education courses with 97.3% average, career counseling sessions with prepared questions, and now this presentation that 42 Marines voluntarily attended. More importantly, you've demonstrated sustained behavioral change over 6 weeks. Your chain of command reports that you've become a mentor to junior Marines, a constructive voice in peer discussions, a model of professional development." Catherine reached into her pocket and pulled out a small box. The room collectively held its breath. She opened it slowly, revealing corporal chevrons, 3 stripes representing promotion and increased responsibility. "Lance Corporal Garrett Sullivan," Catherine said formally, her voice carrying the full weight of command authority. "By order of the Commandant of the Marine Corps, and based on your demonstrated leadership potential and sustained superior performance, you are hereby meritoriously promoted to the rank of corporal, effective immediately." The room exploded. 42 Marines rose to their feet, applauding with genuine enthusiasm. This wasn't just recognition of Sullivan's achievement, it was validation that transformation was possible, that mistakes didn't have to define a career, that authentic change produced real results. Catherine removed Sullivan's Lance Corporal chevrons with practiced precision and replaced them with the new corporal insignia. His face showed shock, then overwhelming emotion, then fierce determination as the weight of new responsibility settled on his shoulders. Around the room, Marines remained standing, not because they had been ordered to, but because they understood they had witnessed something rare and important, a teaching moment that would influence how they thought about leadership and growth for the rest of their careers. When the applause finally died down, Catherine reached into her other pocket and pulled out something else, a business card, worn and faded, the text barely legible after years of handling and transfer between pockets and wallets. She held it up so Sullivan could see clearly. "This belonged to Brigadier General Robert Thorne, the officer who mentored me 14 years ago when I made the same kind of mistake you made, disrespecting someone based on assumptions about their importance. He gave it to me at the end of our conversation with instructions to keep it until I found a Marine to pass it on to. I've been carrying it for 14 years, waiting for the right moment." She placed the card carefully in Sullivan's hand, closing his fingers around it. "This is that moment. Someday, Corporal Sullivan, maybe years from now, you'll encounter a young Marine who makes the same mistakes you made. You'll face the choice between punishment and mentorship. And if you choose mentorship, if you invest in their growth the way I invested in yours, and General Thorne invested in mine, then you'll give them this card and continue the cycle." Sullivan's hand trembled slightly as he looked down at the worn card. His eyes glistened with emotion he barely controlled. "Ma'am, I won't break this chain, I promise you." "I know you won't, Corporal. Now get out of here. You've got junior Marines to mentor and leadership responsibilities to prepare for." After the Marines filed out, energized and talking excitedly about what they had witnessed, Catherine remained in the briefing room with Dalton. "Ma'am, that was exceptional," the gunnery sergeant said quietly. "Both the promotion and the ceremony with the card. I've been in the Corps 22 years, and I've never seen anything quite like it. It's not my innovation, Gunny. It's General Thorne's. He created this tradition of passing forward the investment that leaders make in their Marines. I'm just continuing what he started. Well, ma'am, whatever you call it, it works. Sullivan is going to be an outstanding NCO. And the 42 Marines who attended this morning are going to spread the word about what they witnessed. You've created a ripple effect that will influence this command for years. Catherine gathered her materials, her mind already shifting to the dozens of other responsibilities that demanded her attention on this Saturday morning. That's the real work of command, Gunny, not the operations and the logistics and the paperwork, though those matter. The real work is shaping culture, one Marine at a time, creating cycles of mentorship that perpetuate themselves, building organizations where people invest in each other's growth rather than simply executing orders. She walked toward the exit, then paused at the door. Keep me informed of Corporal Sullivan's progress over the next 6 months. I want to know if this transformation sticks, or if it was just performance for promotion. Understood, ma'am, but if I'm being honest, I think it stuck. What we witnessed this morning wasn't performance. That was genuine. Catherine allowed herself a small smile. I think so too, Gunny. I think so too. The education of Corporal Garrett Sullivan had reached its first major milestone, but the real test was still to come. November 20th, 2024, 0900 hours, Camp Pendleton, California. 6 months had passed since the mess hall incident that changed everything. The morning broke cold and clear over Camp Pendleton, painting the Pacific horizon in shades of crimson and gold. The parade field had been prepared with meticulous attention to detail. White lines marked with geometric precision, flag positioned at exact intervals. Reviewing stands assembled for distinguished visitors and senior officers. Today was a change of command ceremony, the kind of formal military pageantry that the Marine Corps executed with practiced excellence. 3,000 Marines stood in formation, their dress blues immaculate, their bearing parade ground perfect. Colonel Catherine Brennan stood on the platform, no longer a colonel. The stars of a brigadier general had been pinned to her collar 3 hours earlier in a private ceremony attended by her family and closest colleagues. At 40 years old, she was one of the youngest female general officers in Marine Corps history. But her attention was not on the ceremony or the promotion or the speeches being delivered by dignitaries. Her eyes tracked across the formations below, finding familiar faces among the thousands of Marines assembled. 3rd Platoon, Alpha Company, 4th rank from the front. Corporal Garrett Sullivan stood at attention with his fire team arrayed behind him. 6 months had transformed the arrogant Lance Corporal into something more substantial. Authority earned through demonstrated competence, not assumed through physical presence. Behind him stood his 4 Marines. Lance Corporal Ethan Porter, the 19-year-old who had been at Sullivan's table that night in April, who had passed his corporal screening on first attempt after Sullivan's mentorship. Private First Class Trevor Daniels, enrolled in college courses through the Tuition Assistance Program, planning his future beyond the Marines. Private Blake Anderson, the Marine who had accused Sullivan of kissing ass, now one of his strongest supporters. Private First Class Connor Morrison, preparing for leadership training next year. Catherine felt something tighten in her chest. Pride at seeing investment pay dividends that compounded over time. The ceremony concluded with traditional precision. Commands echoed across the parade field. Formations shifted with synchronized movement. 3,000 Marines saluted as the colors were retired and new colors raised to signify the change in leadership. Catherine descended from the platform as the formations began to disperse. The reception would follow in the officers' club, speeches and handshakes and professional networking. But before she could reach the reception, a voice called out behind her. "Ma'am, Brigadier General Brennan requests permission to approach." She turned to find Corporal Sullivan standing at attention, his 4 Marine fire team arrayed behind him in perfect alignment. Permission granted, Corporal. Sullivan and his Marines approached with measured steps, stopping at the regulation 3 feet. Ma'am, Corporal Sullivan requesting permission to introduce my fire team. Catherine smiled, recognizing the formality as Sullivan's way of honoring the significance of this moment. Permission granted. Sullivan gestured to each Marine in turn, his voice carrying genuine pride. This is Lance Corporal Porter, my team leader. Private First Class Daniels, rifleman. Private Anderson, automatic rifleman. And Private First Class Morrison, assistant automatic rifleman. He paused, then continued with evident satisfaction. Marines, this is Brigadier General Catherine Brennan, the officer who taught me what leadership actually means. Each Marine shook Catherine's hand with varying degrees of nervousness. Meeting a general officer in a social setting was clearly outside their comfort zone, but Sullivan had prepared them well. Their handshakes were firm, their eye contact appropriate, their bearing professional. How are your Marines performing, Corporal Sullivan? Catherine asked. Sullivan's face reflected genuine satisfaction rather than mere compliance with expectations. Outstanding, ma'am. Porter just passed his corporal screening on first attempt. Daniels is maintaining a 3.7 GPA in his college courses. Anderson qualified expert on the rifle range last month with a 298. And Morrison is preparing for leadership training next year. And their attitudes toward the Marine Corps? Toward leadership? Toward their own career development? Sullivan understood the deeper question she was asking. Not just about technical performance, but about cultural transformation. Ma'am, they don't complain in smoke pits about systems they don't understand. They research policies before forming opinions. They bring concerns through proper channels. They take responsibility for their own professional development. He paused, a slight smile crossing his face. I wonder where they learned that. Outstanding, Catherine replied. That's exactly what the Marine Corps needs. Morrison spoke up hesitantly, his youth evident in his uncertain tone, but his courage evident in his willingness to speak. Ma'am, if I may, Corporal Sullivan tells us about what happened in the mess hall 6 months ago, about how you could have ended his career but chose to teach him instead. That story has influenced how I think about leadership. I want to be the kind of leader who invests in others like you invested in him. Catherine felt emotion tighten her throat. This was the ripple effect she had hoped for, but couldn't guarantee. Morrison had never met her until this moment, but Sullivan's transformation had already shaped the young Marine's philosophy of leadership. Private First Class Morrison, if you commit to that philosophy, if you genuinely invest in the growth of the Marines around you, then you will accomplish more important work than any tactical mission or operational objective. The real mission of the Marine Corps isn't the battles we fight. It's the leaders we develop who will fight the battles we cannot yet imagine. Movement at the edge of her vision drew Catherine's attention. A Navy admiral was approaching through the dispersing crowd. Rear Admiral Thomas Bradley Patterson, 62 years old, distinguished naval career spanning 4 decades, and the officer who had publicly questioned Catherine's appointment to command the 2nd MEU 9 months earlier. Patterson waited patiently while Catherine finished her conversation with Sullivan's fire team, then stepped forward with deliberate formality that suggested official business rather than casual congratulations. General Brennan, he said, his voice carrying the weight of formal address. Then his tone shifted, becoming more personal and considerably more humble. Catherine, I owe you an apology. Sullivan and his Marines stepped back respectfully, recognizing that this conversation required privacy despite occurring in public. 9 months ago, I questioned whether you were ready for command of the 2nd MEU. I suggested in official channels that your appointment was political rather than merit-based. I expressed concerns about whether a female officer could command the respect necessary for combat operations. Patterson's voice carried genuine contrition rather than performative regret. I was wrong on every level. Catherine maintained her professional composure, though internally she felt vindication wash over her like a cleansing wave. Not vindication in the sense of proving someone wrong for personal satisfaction, but vindication in the deeper sense of demonstrating that her approach to leadership produced measurable results. "Sir, I appreciate you saying that," Patterson continued, his expression showing that this apology had been carefully considered rather than impulsively offered. "Under your command, the 2nd MEU achieved the highest readiness ratings in the Fleet Marine Force. Your unit's morale scores are exceptional. Your deployment performance exceeded every benchmark. But what impressed me most was the culture you created. Marines throughout the Corps are talking about your mentorship approach, about how you transform disciplined problems into exemplary leaders. That's the kind of leadership the Marine Corps desperately needs, and I was too narrow-minded to recognize it 9 months ago. Sir, we all make judgments based on incomplete information. What matters is our willingness to update those judgments when new evidence emerges." Patterson smiled slightly, recognizing grace in her response. Gracious even in vindication. That's the mark of true leadership, General. The Marine Corps is fortunate to have you, and I'm fortunate that my earlier skepticism didn't prevent your success. As Patterson moved toward the reception, Sullivan caught Catherine's eye with a look that suggested he understood the significance of what had just occurred. "Ma'am, that's the Admiral who questioned your appointment, isn't it?" "It is. How does it feel to prove him wrong?" Catherine considered the question carefully, recognizing it as an opportunity to reinforce the lessons Sullivan had been learning. "It feels like validation, but not the kind I expected. The real victory isn't proving Admiral Patterson wrong about me. It's proving that leadership based on mentorship and investment produces better results than leadership based on authority and punishment. The culture we created in the MEU, the transformation we achieved with Marines like you, that's what actually matters." The Admiral's opinion was just noise. Sullivan nodded, processing this perspective shift from personal vindication to organizational impact. "Speaking of transformation, ma'am, I want you to know that I'm keeping General Thorne's card safe. I pull it out whenever I'm dealing with a Marine who's struggling, and I remember that someone invested in my growth when I didn't deserve it. That reminder keeps me patient, keeps me focused on mentorship rather than just punishment." "Good. That's exactly what the card is meant to do. Have you had any opportunities to use what you learned?" "Yes, ma'am. Last month, one of my Marines disrespected a civilian contractor at the motor pool. Same situation as me in the mess hall, basically. I pulled him aside and used the Socratic method you taught me. Asked him questions that made him examine his own behavior rather than just ordering him to apologize. It worked, ma'am. He genuinely understood what he'd done wrong and why it mattered. I could see the moment it clicked for him, the same way it clicked for me that night." Catherine felt profound satisfaction hearing this confirmation that the cycle was continuing, the ripples spreading outward, the culture of mentorship perpetuating itself through another generation. "That Marine is fortunate to have you as his team leader, Corporal. I'm fortunate to have had you as my teacher, ma'am." December 5th, 2024, 14:30 hours, Camp Pendleton Motor Pool. 2 weeks after the change of command ceremony, Corporal Garrett Sullivan faced the first real test of whether his transformation had been genuine or merely performance for promotion. The motor pool was organized chaos, Humvees in various states of maintenance, mechanics working with practiced efficiency on complex repairs, the smell of diesel and hydraulic fluid and industrial solvents mixing in the afternoon air. Sullivan was conducting routine vehicle inspections with his fire team when he witnessed the incident that would determine what kind of leader he had truly become. Private First Class Trevor Daniels had been tasked with coordinating with a civilian contractor about replacement parts for damaged suspension systems on 3 Humvees scheduled for deployment readiness testing. The contractor was a woman in her 50s, experienced and professional, carrying a tablet with inventory lists and delivery timelines. Sullivan watched from 30 feet away as Daniels approached the contractor with his paperwork, maintaining his supervisory distance while allowing his Marine to handle the interaction independently. The conversation started professionally, Daniels explaining what parts were needed, the contractor checking her inventory system, standard coordination that should have taken 5 minutes. Then something shifted in the dynamic. The contractor informed Daniels that the specific parts he requested were on backorder from the manufacturer. 3-week delay minimum. Daniels' frustration was visible even from Sullivan's position. His body language changed, his voice raised slightly. Sullivan moved closer, not intervening yet, but positioning himself to observe and assess. Daniels said something Sullivan couldn't quite hear. The contractor's expression changed from professional to offended. Her posture stiffened. Then Daniels's voice carried clearly across the motor pool. "Look, I don't care about your inventory problems. This is Marine Corps equipment. We have priority. Figure it out." The contractor's response was firm but controlled, professional despite clear irritation. "Young man, I understand your urgency, but speaking to me that way isn't going to make parts materialize from thin air. I'm explaining the situation. You can accept it professionally, or you can speak to my supervisor about expediting the order through proper channels." Daniels made a dismissive gesture, his frustration overriding his professionalism. "Whatever. Just another civilian who doesn't understand how things work in the real military." Sullivan felt something cold settle in his stomach. 6 months ago, that had been him, arrogant, dismissive, treating people poorly based on assumptions about their status and importance, believing that uniform and mission granted license for disrespect. The question now was what kind of leader he would be. Punish or mentor? Apply regulations or apply wisdom? Document and discipline or invest and teach? He thought of General Thorne's business card, carried in his wallet every day since June. He thought of Colonel Brennan standing in that mess hall, water-stained and calm, offering him multiple chances to correct his behavior before revealing her identity. He thought of the promise he had made to not break the chain. Sullivan crossed the motor pool with deliberate steps, his mind already running through the approach he would take. "Private Daniels, a word please." Daniels turned, his expression still showing residual frustration from the interaction, clearly expecting his team leader to support his position against the contractor's unhelpful attitude. "Corporal, this contractor is telling me we can't get the parts we need for 3 weeks. That's unacceptable for our readiness timeline." "Step over here with me, Daniels." Sullivan led him 20 feet away from the contractor, out of direct earshot but still visible to the rest of the fire team. This needed to be private, but not secret. Leadership development worked better with witnesses who could learn from observation. "Daniels, I want you to think about something carefully before you answer. How did you treat that contractor when you thought she was just an obstacle to your mission?" Daniels blinked, clearly not expecting this line of questioning when he had anticipated validation of his frustration. "I was frustrated, Corporal. We need those parts for the inspection next month. I didn't ask about your frustration. I asked how you treated her." Silence. Daniel's face began to change as he processed the question and recognized the trap in his own behavior. Sullivan continued, his voice quiet, but carrying absolute clarity born from personal experience with this exact situation. "Now, if that contractor turns out to be someone important, someone whose cooperation you need for future missions, someone who has the authority to expedite or delay every parts request from this unit for the next year, how do you wish you had treated her?" Recognition dawned on Daniel's face, horror following close behind as the implications became clear. "What does that difference say about your character?" The words were exact quotes from Colonel Brennan, the same questions she had asked Sullivan in her office 6 months ago. Sullivan had memorized them, internalized them, turned them into a framework for understanding behavior and consequence and the importance of consistent character. Daniel struggled to respond. His mouth opened, closed. his brain clearly working through painful self-examination that cut deeper than any formal counseling would have. Finally, his voice came out quiet and honest. "Corporal, I was disrespectful. I made assumptions about her importance based on her job. I treated her poorly because I thought I could get away with it. Because she's a contractor and I'm a Marine, and I thought that meant I had some kind of authority over her." "Exactly right. And what should you do now?" "Apologize, sincerely, not because she might be important, but because she deserves respect regardless of who she is or what power she has over our parts requests." Sullivan felt something shift in his chest. The same sensation Colonel Brennan must have felt watching him arrive at understanding through guided questioning rather than direct orders. Pride mixed with satisfaction, mixed with hope that the cycle was truly continuing. "Outstanding. Go make it right, Daniels." Sullivan watched as Daniels returned to the contractor and delivered what appeared to be a genuine apology rather than a perfunctory compliance with orders. The contractor's expression softened noticeably. She pulled out her tablet again, made several entries with renewed focus, and handed Daniels a printout. From the body language and Daniels' surprised expression, Sullivan could tell she had found a solution that hadn't been offered before the apology. When Daniels returned, his face showed a mixture of relief and shame and dawning understanding. "She found parts from a different inventory source. We'll have them in 5 days instead of 3 weeks. All because I apologized and asked for her help instead of demanding it like I had some kind of authority over her." Remember this moment, Daniels. You just learned something more valuable than any technical skill. Character has to be consistent regardless of who you're dealing with. You can't turn respect on and off based on someone's rank or position or usefulness to your immediate goals. That kind of conditional respect isn't respect at all. It's just manipulation and self-interest. "I understand, Corporal. Thank you for not just writing me up. I almost did. 6 months ago I would have. But someone taught me that mentorship produces better results than punishment when the Marine demonstrates capacity for growth. You just demonstrated that capacity." Later that evening, Sullivan submitted a counseling report to Captain Rachel Winters. Not a negative entry for Daniel's service record that would follow him through his career. A positive documentation of a teaching moment and the Marine's appropriate response and demonstrated growth. Winters read the report carefully and called Sullivan into her office the next morning. "Corporal Sullivan, this is well done. But I have to ask, are you sure you're not being too soft? Daniels was disrespectful to a civilian contractor. That warrants formal counseling at minimum, according to standard procedures." Sullivan met her eyes directly, his response prepared because he had anticipated this question. "Ma'am, 6 months ago, someone was too soft on me. Colonel Brennan could have destroyed my career with one phone call. Instead, she invested time and energy teaching me. That investment changed my life and the lives of 20 Marines around me who were listening to my toxic complaints. I'm just paying forward what she gave me." Winters studied him for a long moment, her expression showing recalibration of her assessment. "You've changed, Sullivan. When you first made corporal, I was skeptical, thought maybe you had just performed well enough to get promoted. But watching you over the past 6 months, I see it's genuine. You're becoming the kind of NCO this Corps needs more of." "Thank you, ma'am. I'm trying." "Keep trying and keep me informed of situations like this. I want to know how your Marines are developing under your leadership." "Will do, ma'am." January 15th, 2025. 1,000 hours. Inspector General's Office, Camp Pendleton. 8 months into Sullivan's transformation, 9 months after the mess hall incident, Corporal Garrett Sullivan faced a crisis that threatened everything he had built. Senior Lance Corporal Brad Wilson, the Marine who had spread rumors about Sullivan kissing ass for promotion, had filed a formal complaint with the Inspector General. The allegation was serious and specific. Sullivan's meritorious promotion in June had been the result of favoritism and gender-based preferential treatment. Colonel Brennan, now General Brennan, had promoted Sullivan not based on merit, but because she needed to justify her soft approach to discipline and demonstrate the success of female leadership. The investigation had been open. Sullivan had been officially notified. An interview had been scheduled. He sat in the waiting area outside the Inspector General's office, his service record book in hand, feeling the same kind of existential dread he had experienced the morning after the mess hall incident. Everything he had worked for over the past 8 months could be destroyed by this investigation. If the IG found evidence of favoritism or gender bias, his promotion would be reversed. His credibility would be shattered. The culture of mentorship he had helped create would be undermined. The door opened. A lieutenant colonel emerged and gestured for Sullivan to enter. The interview room was austere. Gray walls, metal desk, recording equipment, 2 chairs facing each other across empty space designed to create psychological pressure. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Hayes conducted the interview with professional detachment. Neither hostile nor friendly, just methodical collection of facts with no indication of predetermined conclusions. Corporal Sullivan, you understand why you're here? Yes, sir. Senior Lance Corporal Wilson has alleged that my meritorious promotion was the result of favoritism rather than merit-based performance. That's correct. I want to hear your account of the circumstances surrounding your promotion. Start from the beginning. Take your time. Be thorough. Sullivan took a deep breath and began. He recounted the mess hall incident with brutal honesty that held nothing back. His disrespectful behavior toward Colonel Brennan, his toxic influence on peers through months of cynical complaints, Colonel Brennan's undercover observation and deliberate positioning, the collision and escalating confrontation, the revelation of her identity. He described the 45-day transformation program in detail, the 3 requirements she had set, the distance education courses he had completed with 97.3% average, the career counseling sessions he had attended with prepared questions, the professional development presentation that 42 Marines had voluntarily attended on a Saturday morning. He showed documentation for everything, course completion certificates with dates and scores, counseling session records signed by his career planner, company commander, and platoon sergeant, attendance rosters from the June presentation with 42 Marine signatures, written testimonials from peers describing how his mentorship had influenced their career decisions and professional development. Hayes listened without interruption, taking methodical notes, asking occasional clarifying questions that probed for inconsistencies or embellishments. After 90 minutes of detailed testimony, Hayes leaned back and asked the critical question. Corporal Sullivan, the allegation is that General Brennan promoted you not because you earned it, but because she needed to justify her mentorship approach. That she had invested so much time in you that she couldn't afford to let you fail. That your promotion was about validating her leadership philosophy rather than recognizing your actual merit. How do you respond to that? Sullivan considered the question carefully, recognizing the trap within it. Sir, I can't speak to General Brennan's motivations. That's between her and her conscience. What I can tell you is what I did during those 45 days. I completed every requirement she set. I scored 97.3% average across all leadership courses. I helped 3 junior Marines with their career development. I organized and delivered a professional development session that 42 Marines voluntarily attended on their Saturday morning. And in the 6 months since my promotion, I've continued demonstrating the same behavioral changes. My chain of command can verify all of this with specific examples and documented evidence. They have, Corporal. I've already interviewed your company commander, your platoon sergeant, and gunnery sergeant Dalton. Their testimonials are consistent with your account and universally positive about your transformation. Hayes pulled out another folder, this one containing Sullivan's complete service record. I've also reviewed your service record from before the mess hall incident. Expert rifle qualification, perfect PFT scores, leadership billets, multiple positive fitness reports from supervisors praising your tactical competence and physical performance. The only thing preventing your promotion through normal channels were the negative counseling entries related to attitude and disrespect toward authority. That's correct, sir. I sabotaged my own career through bad behavior and toxic attitude. And you believe General Brennan's intervention corrected that behavior? I know it did, sir. Because I'm not the same Marine I was 9 months ago, and I have documentation to prove sustained change, not just short-term performance for promotion. Hayes made additional notes. The interview continued for another 30 minutes. Every aspect of the promotion examined, every potential bias explored, every alternative explanation considered. Finally, Hayes set down his pen and looked directly at Sullivan. Corporal Sullivan, I'm going to be direct with you. Senior Lance Corporal Wilson's complaint appears to be motivated by personal grievance rather than genuine concern about policy violations. Your promotion was well documented, properly authorized through official channels, and based on demonstrated merit. However, I'm going to interview one more witness before I make my final determination. Gunnery Sergeant Dalton has requested to provide additional testimony. He'll be here in 10 minutes. You're dismissed until I call you back. Sullivan left the interview room and returned to the waiting area. His heart was pounding. Everything depended on what Dalton would say. 10 minutes later, Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Dalton entered the Inspector General's office carrying a folder of his own. 22 years of service had taught him exactly how to present evidence and defend Marines who deserve defending. The interview lasted 45 minutes. Sullivan couldn't hear what was being said through the closed door, but he could see through the office window that Dalton was speaking with a kind of conviction that came from absolute certainty based on direct observation. When Dalton emerged, he caught Sullivan's eye and gave a subtle nod. Not quite a smile, but an unmistakable signal that the testimony had gone well. Hayes called Sullivan back into the office 30 minutes later. His expression was professionally neutral, but his tone carried finality. Corporal Sullivan, I've completed my investigation. I'm dismissing Senior Lance Corporal Wilson's complaint as lacking merit and motivated by personal grievance rather than legitimate policy concerns. Your meritorious promotion was properly authorized and based on documented performance that exceeded normal standards. This investigation is closed. Sullivan felt tension drain from his body like water from a broken vessel. However, Hayes continued with emphasis, I want you to understand something important. The IG process exists to protect Marines from actual favoritism and bias. Wilson was within his rights to file this complaint, even though it ultimately proved unfounded. The fact that the investigation cleared you doesn't mean he was wrong to raise concerns. Healthy organizations need people willing to question processes. Do you understand? Yes, sir. I understand completely. Good. You're dismissed. Keep doing what you're doing, Corporal. The Marine Corps needs more NCOs like you. Outside the office, Dalton was waiting. Gunny, what did you tell him? Dalton smiled slightly, the first real emotion he'd shown all morning. I told him I've been in the Corps 22 years. I've seen a lot of young Marines talk about changing. Promise they'll do better. Make temporary improvements that fade as soon as supervision decreases. I told him, you're different. That what we witnessed wasn't performance designed to earn promotion. It was genuine transformation that has been sustained for 8 months now through multiple tests. And I told him that your transformation has been multiplicative, that you're not just following orders better, you're creating more leaders by investing in Marines the same way General Brennan invested in you. Thank you, Gunny. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't testified on my behalf. You would have been fine, Corporal. You had documentation for everything. But I wanted to make sure the IG understood that this wasn't about paperwork and compliance. It was about real change, creating real impact across an entire unit. Sullivan returned to his duties with renewed determination. The investigation had been a test not of his technical qualifications, which were documented, but of whether the foundation he had built could withstand external pressure and scrutiny. It had. April 15th, 2025, 18:30 hours, Camp Pendleton Mess Hall. Exactly 1 year after the collision that changed everything, Sergeant Garrett Sullivan walked into the enlisted mess hall at Camp Pendleton wearing the 3 stripes and 2 rockers of his new rank. Promoted again just 2 weeks earlier, now leading a full squad of 13 Marines instead of just a fire team of 4. The mess hall looked exactly as it had 1 year ago. Same layout, same industrial ceiling fans rotating slowly overhead. Same photographs of Marine Corps history on the walls. Same smell of fried chicken and steamed vegetables, and that peculiar metallic scent all military dining facilities shared. But everything else had changed. Sullivan grabbed a tray and moved through the serving line. The young private working the line smiled as he loaded Sullivan's tray. "Sergeant Sullivan, congratulations on your promotion, sir." "Not sir, Private. I work for a living. But thank you." Sullivan carried his tray to a table near the beverage station. Not the same table where Colonel Brennan had sat, but close enough to trigger memories. He sat down and looked around the mess hall with transformed perspective. He saw junior Marines eating together, their conversations animated and positive. No toxic complaining about rigged systems. No cynical assumptions about leadership caring only about politics. Just professional Marines discussing training, deployment preparation, career goals. He saw NCOs mentoring younger Marines at their tables, answering questions, providing guidance, creating the culture of investment that Colonel Brennan had taught him to value above all other leadership responsibilities. He saw the future of the Marine Corps being shaped in real time through thousands of small interactions that would compound over years and decades. His phone buzzed. An email notification from an address he recognized immediately. From Brigadier General Catherine Brennan to Sergeant Garrett Sullivan. Subject: 1 year. Sergeant Sullivan, 1 year ago today, you bumped a table in the mess hall and changed the trajectory of your career. I wanted to mark this anniversary by telling you how proud I am of the Marine you've become. Your company commander reports that you're running monthly professional development sessions now. 50 Marines attending voluntarily. That's 15 more than your first session. Your platoon sergeant tells me that 3 of your squad members have been meritoriously promoted in the past 6 months. That you've created a culture where Marines actively mentor each other instead of waiting for formal programs. And Gunny Dalton mentioned that you recently spent 4 hours counseling a young PFC with anger issues. Using the same Socratic method I used with you, teaching instead of punishing. That's the mission, Sergeant, not the battles we fight, the leaders we develop. General Thorne would be proud. I'm proud. Keep paying it forward. Semper Fidelis, B. Gen. Brennan. Sullivan read the email twice, feeling emotion tighten his throat. He pulled out his phone and composed a reply. "Ma'am, thank you for the investment you made in me when I didn't deserve it. I'm doing my best to honor that investment by paying it forward to the next generation. The PFC I counseled last week reminded me of myself a year ago. Angry, arrogant, making assumptions based on ignorance, but also capable of growth if someone is willing to invest the time. I pulled out General Thorne's card and looked at it before our session. Reminded myself that patience and wisdom produce better results than authority and punishment. I think he's going to make it, ma'am. Just like I did. The tradition continues. Semper Fi, Sergeant Sullivan." He hit send and returned to his meal. A young private first class approached his table hesitantly, clearly working up courage. "Sergeant Sullivan, I'm PFC Thompson. Corporal Porter told me I should talk to you about preparing for my Lance Corporal board." Sullivan looked up at the nervous Marine standing before him. Young, uncertain, clearly struggling with confidence about whether he deserved the promotion he was pursuing. 1 year ago, Sullivan would have dismissed this interruption, would have told Thompson to figure it out himself, would have complained about junior Marines expecting to be spoon-fed instead of taking initiative. Now he saw opportunity, a chance to invest, to mentor, to create another link in the chain that extended from General Thorne, through Colonel Brennan, through himself. Pull up a chair, Thompson. Let's talk about what you need to do to be ready. Thompson sat with visible relief, pulled out a notebook, ready to learn. For the next 30 minutes, Sergeant Garrett Sullivan taught a young Marine about leadership and career development and the importance of taking responsibility for your own growth, while also accepting help from those who had walked the path before. Just as he had been taught 1 year ago by a colonel in civilian clothes who had chosen mentorship over punishment, the cycle continued. May 1st, 2025, 1400 hours, Division Headquarters. Brigadier General Catherine Brennan sat in her office, reviewing the monthly leadership development metrics from across her division. The numbers told a story that statistics alone couldn't fully capture, but that organizational analysts found remarkable. Re-enlistment rates up 17% over the previous year. Meritorious promotions up 23%. Negative counseling entries down 31%. Professional military education completion up 42%. Morale scores reaching levels not seen in the division for over a decade. But the numbers that mattered most to her weren't in official reports. She opened a different file on her computer: personal correspondence. Emails and letters from Marines across her division who had been influenced by the culture she had worked to create. 23 letters from junior Marines describing mentorship they had received from NCOs who had attended Sullivan's professional development sessions or learned his methods through their chain of command. 14 emails from company commanders reporting improved morale and reduced disciplinary issues in units where Sullivan's approach to leadership development had been adopted by other NCOs. 7 formal recommendations for meritorious promotion of NCOs who had demonstrated exceptional mentorship of junior Marines using techniques they learned from Sullivan's presentations. And 1 email with a photograph attached, a worn business card that had been photographed and sent to her by a young Lance Corporal named Jackson. The email explained that Sergeant Sullivan had given him the card after helping him overcome anger management issues that had nearly resulted in a court-martial. The card was being passed forward. The 4th generation now. General Thorne to her to Sullivan, Sullivan to Jackson. Catherine opened her email and composed a message to General Robert Thorne, retired, 67 years old, living in Virginia and following the careers of the officers he had mentored with professional interest and quiet pride. General Thorne, I wanted to update you on the progress of a particular Marine. His name is Sergeant Garrett Sullivan. 9 months ago, he was a Lance Corporal with attitude problems and toxic influence on his peers. Today, he's a squad leader who runs voluntary professional development sessions for 50 Marines monthly. More importantly, he passed your card to a young Marine last week. That Marine sent me a photo of it. The card you gave me 14 years ago is now in its 4th generation of influence. I think about that gym at Quantico sometimes, about how you could have ended my career with 1 word, but chose to invest 2 hours teaching me instead. That investment has now multiplied through Sullivan and through this young Marine Jackson and through who knows how many others whose names I'll never learn. That's the mission, sir. Leaders developing leaders who develop leaders. The tradition continues. Semper Fidelis, B-Gen, Catherine Brennan. The reply came within minutes. Thorne clearly checking his email regularly despite retirement. Catherine, that's 3 generations now visible to you. 4 if you count the Marines Sullivan mentored before Jackson. But the real number is unknowable and probably uncountable. Every Marine you influence goes on to influence others. The ripples spread in directions you'll never see, touching lives in ways you'll never know. That's why the investment matters. Not because we see all the results, but because we trust that excellence, once demonstrated and taught, perpetuates itself through the character of good people making good choices. You asked me once why I spent 2 hours teaching an arrogant lieutenant instead of just ending her career with 1 phone call. I'll tell you what I didn't say then. Because my mentor did the same for me 30 years ago, and his mentor did it for him before that. This chain extends back generations before either of us was born. We're just the current links carrying it forward. Keep paying it forward, Brigadier General. The Marine Corps needs more leaders who understand that the real mission isn't victory in battle. It's victory in leadership development that ensures future victories by future Marines we'll never meet. Semper Fidelis, Robert Thorne, Lieutenant General, USMC, retired. Catherine read the email twice, absorbing not just the words but the weight of tradition and responsibility they carried. Then she stood and moved to her window, looking out at Camp Pendleton spread below. Thousands of Marines training, working, developing into the warriors and leaders the nation would need for conflicts yet unknown, in battles not yet imagined. Somewhere in that sprawling base, Sergeant Sullivan was mentoring his squad, teaching young Marines that character had to be consistent, that respect couldn't be situation dependent, that excellence required investment in patience and wisdom rather than just technical competence and physical prowess. Somewhere, a young Marine named Jackson was carrying General Thorne's business card in his wallet, pulling it out when he faced difficult leadership decisions, remembering that someone had invested in him when he didn't deserve it. Somewhere the culture was changing, one conversation at a time, one mentorship session at a time, one Marine at a time choosing to invest in others, rather than simply executing orders and pursuing promotion. That was the real victory. Not the battles won, or the missions accomplished, or the ranks achieved, but the culture transformed, the tradition perpetuated, the chain of excellence extended one more generation into the future. Catherine's phone rang, her aide informing her that the division commander needed her at a briefing in 20 minutes. She gathered her materials and headed for the door. The work continued, always continued. More Marines to develop, more leaders to mentor, more opportunities to invest in growth rather than simply punish failure. As she walked through the headquarters building, she passed a group of young lieutenants studying for their professional military education exams. They snapped to attention as she passed. She paused. "As you were, what are you studying?" One of the lieutenants, a young woman barely 24 years old, answered, "Leadership theory, ma'am. We're discussing different approaches to developing junior Marines." "What have you concluded?" The lieutenant hesitated, clearly uncertain whether a general officer wanted to hear her actual thoughts or just receive a textbook answer that demonstrated she'd done the reading. "Permission to speak freely, ma'am." "Granted, we've concluded that the most effective leadership development happens through mentorship rather than formal training. That junior Marines learn more from watching how their leaders handle difficult situations than from any classroom instruction or PowerPoint presentation." Catherine smiled with genuine warmth. "Outstanding conclusion, and completely correct. Remember that when you get to your units, your Marines are watching everything you do, every decision you make, every interaction you have. You're teaching them what leadership means, whether you intend to or not. Make sure you're teaching the right lessons." "Yes, ma'am, we will." Catherine continued toward the briefing, but her mind was still on that conversation. Those young lieutenants would soon lead Marines in combat, would make decisions that determined who lived and died, would shape the next generation of Marine Corps leadership through their example. If they internalized the lesson about mentorship, they would pay it forward to their Marines. Who would pay it forward to the generation after that? The chain extending indefinitely into the future. That night, back in her quarters after the briefing, in the paperwork and the hundreds of small decisions that filled a general officer's day, Catherine sat at her desk and pulled out a worn photograph she kept in a locked drawer. Her father, Master Sergeant Thomas Brennan, killed in action in Somalia, 1993. She had been 14 years old when the notification team arrived at their house. He had taught her that leadership meant taking care of people. That rank imposed obligation rather than conferring privilege. That the mission was measured not in battles won, but in lives improved through service and sacrifice. She had spent 20 years trying to honor those lessons, to be the kind of leader he would have been proud of, to pay forward the investment he had made in her character during those brief 14 years before Somalia took him away. And now, through General Thorne, and through Sullivan, and through Jackson, and through all the Marines they would influence in turn, that investment continued to compound across time and distance. Her father's wisdom, filtered through generations, still shaping young lives decades after his death. That was the real immortality. Not monuments or medals or even memories, but influence that perpetuated itself through teaching and mentorship and the deliberate choice to invest in others. Catherine set the photograph back in the drawer and opened her laptop. One more email to write before sleep. To Sergeant Garrett Sullivan, from Brigadier General Catherine Brennan. Subject: The mission continues. Sergeant Sullivan, I wanted you to know that your mentorship of Lance Corporal Jackson has been noted at the highest levels. He sent me a photo of General Thorne's card. The tradition is now in its 4th generation. Your company commander has recommended you for promotion to Staff Sergeant. I've endorsed that recommendation without hesitation. If the board agrees, you'll be wearing E6 chevrons by the end of the year. But more importantly, you've created a culture in your squad that other units are trying to replicate. 3 company commanders have asked for your professional development presentation materials to use with their own Marines. That's the real promotion, Sergeant, not rank. Influence. Keep paying it forward. Semper Fidelis, B. Jen Brennan. She hit send and closed the laptop. The next morning, Catherine received one more email. No subject line, just a photo attachment. Sergeant Sullivan standing with his squad, 13 Marines, all smiling. In the foreground, clearly visible and held with obvious pride, PFC Thompson holding General Thorne's business card like a trophy, representing something larger than himself. The caption read, Generation 5 begins today. Thank you for showing us the way, Sergeant Sullivan. Catherine saved the photo to her desktop, titled it simply, The Mission. Then she stood, put on her cover, and walked out to meet the day. 3,000 Marines were waiting. Some would need discipline. Some would need guidance. Some would need the same kind of investment she had received from Thorne, given to Sullivan, and watched ripple outward like stones thrown in still water, creating endless expanding circles. That was the work, the real work, the only work that mattered when everything else was stripped away. Leaders developing leaders, developing leaders. One conversation at a time. One mentorship session at a time. One Marine at a time, choosing excellence over expediency, choosing investment over punishment, choosing to build rather than tear down. That was victory. The only kind that truly mattered. The only kind that lasted beyond individual careers and lifetimes. Catherine Brennan, Brigadier General, United States Marine Corps, walked across Camp Pendleton as the California sun rose over the Pacific. The education that had begun in a mess hall 1 year ago continued, and would continue long after she retired, long after Sullivan retired, long after every Marine currently serving had passed the torch to the next generation. That was the promise, the tradition, the mission. Excellence passed forward, generation after generation, forever. Semper Fidelis.